I'm Estelle Bingham, and this is the Love Purpose Connection podcast. Here on Love Purpose Connection, I want to explore how to discover and really develop the secrets of a good life. I'm a holistic therapist and healer, and so over this series, I'll be sharing frank, inspiring, sometimes raw, often joyful conversations with a different guest each time, exploring just what those three words really mean, but also crucially, how you can discover and develop them in your own life. Hello and welcome to the first of a new series of the Love Purpose Connection podcast. And I'm so excited to be here with you all again. I'm really looking forward to bringing you all of these conversations, thought-provoking, human, inspirational. And we're going to kick off that journey today with psychologist, mythologist, and author of If Women Rose Rooted, Dr. Sharon Blackie. Now, this is a really fantastic book, and if you haven't read it yet, put it on the top of the list because it is quite magical. It's all about how the old stories, the myths and the fairy tales that surround us can bring us back to our sense of belonging and actually our intuition. What I wanted to share with you from this conversation is her profound belief in the wisdom which we can draw from the mythic imagination and the mythic feminine, but also her wonderfully frank and practical suggestions for how we can do this, how we can bring the sacred into the everyday. Sharon, welcome to the Love Purpose Connection podcast. Absolute joy that you're here to talk about one of my favourite books of all time, If Women Rose Rooted.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
You've actually been on retreat and you're kind of emerging into 2022. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it started a couple of years ago when having been remarkably well, healthy and fit all of my life, I started to get some symptoms of this and that. And to cut a very long story short, it resolved into a lymphoma diagnosis around about this time last year. So I had to have chemotherapy, which for lymphoma is always fairly brutal because obviously you can't do anything surgical about it. You know, chemotherapy is all you have. And right at the beginning of it, I made the decision that I was going to cut everything back except the basics. The basics that I kept was finishing the book that I've just handed in, which is called Haggitude and is about stories of elderhood in women. So it seemed very pertinent. And so apart from that, I've really been, for once in my life, having had a serial habit of overdoing things and overcommitting, I've actually had a year that's been quite gentle, where I've rested and thought a lot and thought very carefully about what I want to do for the rest of my years.
And what does that look like? And what is sort of coming into form for you?
Well, it's curious. For many years now, I suppose I've always had a bit of a tension between the writer in me that likes to be introverted, solitary, not very much out there, and the teacher, which requires me to be a lot more visible than I'm actually comfortable with from time to time. I love the teaching, but I don't really like all of the stuff that goes with it, the kind of public figure archetype and what have you. So there's been a tension in that sense, I think, for a number of years. And really what I've found, I think, is just a way of balancing that without doing too much, that the emphasis will always be on the writing, but a recognition that there is some teaching that I love to do. Without that interaction with readers, I'd miss it anyway if I didn't do it.
So Sharon, what I love about your books and what I love about Women Rose Rooted, which I think was mentioned somewhere that it became a word of mouth bestseller. It was something that women in such a profound way would recommend to other women or see them reading it, or it would just speak to them. The title would speak to them. And one of the things that stands out to me is the personability. So when I start reading, I go on this journey with you, I recognize myself in it. And that's obviously, it's a story that is recognised by many women around the world.
Yeah, I think that's been the reaction from most people. And, I didn't really set out to write the book that it turned out to be. I wasn't intending to make it quite that personal in terms of my own story, but I had a very fine and very experienced nonfiction editor who said, look, if you're going to try suggesting to people how they might live, you might want to tell them how you've managed it. And so all of a sudden I found myself doing a little bit more autobiography and memoir than I had intended. But, I've always been fairly honest about my life and the things I'm good at, the things I'm not good at, the mistakes I've made, and what have you. I really don't see any other way to be. We learn from our mistakes. They help us grow. So why hide them or try to gloss over them? And so it didn't seem to me particularly difficult to write about all the stuff in my life that I'd messed up. Whereas a lot of people have found that kind of quite disarming. I think, the kind of honesty that they say they don't always find in other books. So I think that's been a big part of it, really, just that ability to say, look, I messed up for many years. I wasn't what I wanted to be for many years. I was living a life that I knew for many years wasn't the life I should be living. But if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be the person that I am now. I gained a lot of skills along the way. And, here I am finally stepping into something that feels a little bit more authentic. And I think that's what a lot of people want to hear, because we live in a world that seems to pressure us to be everything that we can be by the time we're 20, and it's a little bit crazy. We have to give ourselves the time to grow and to learn.
Yeah, the intimacy, that's the thing. It's the intimacy. So even when you share your story and you step into it, there's so much courage and that intimacy, which is what we miss and we lack so much of. And one of the things that I do in my work is really invite people back into that intimate relationship, first with themselves through the heart and then with the land. And I love the way that you did start with your child. You started with this place where being in the female body and witnessing your mother, the violence of your growing, and then that story of how you sat on the hill. I mean, I was really there with you when you had that dislocation, that moment of separation from nature, because it was associated with trauma.
Yeah, I think when I was younger, I don't think I was a particularly embodied person. I kind of escaped out of my body, probably into my head, into books, particularly because I wasn't really growing up it wasn't nearly as bad as the situation that many people face, but it was uncomfortable at times, yeah. And so I tended to escape. I really wasn't very comfortable in my body. I wasn't very comfortable in a female body. I didn't have any good female role models around me. So, that's why I took, as I wrote about in the book, what I think of as the classic masculine hero's journey, because I didn't really know what it was to be a woman. And it wasn't until probably my late 30s when, bizarrely, I decided to learn to fly, to overcome a fear of flying, and it was all tied in with some grander midlife crisis, that I actually began to look at my body and think, oh my goodness, this could die, this could break if I fall out of the sky or whatever. And it really, for the first time, having risked everything, I think made me understand what it was that I had to gain by trying to reclaim some sense of what feminine wisdom was. And it was all tied up with the land. Because, as I say in the book, the stories of my tradition, the mythical stories, the folklore stories, are all tied up with women and the land.
So tell us a little bit about how you went on your heroine's journey, because you took that Joseph Campbell model of the hero's journey, which is this idea of going out and coming back with the treasure of self in some way. And you've kind of rejigged that, and you've created this idea of going back into the feminine as a woman and going on the heroine's journey. So for people who don't really understand that, could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I called it, in If Women Rose Rooted, I called it the eco-heroine's journey, just because I wanted to really stress, the idea that it was very much a journey towards an entanglement with place and with the land. More recently, I've been calling it the post-heroic journey, because I think in many ways it applies just as much to men, to other genders, as it does to women. And it's very much against this idea that Campbell puts forward of the kind of individualistic, kind of swashbuckling hero who rides into the other world or wherever it might be and kills anything that looks like it might need killing, and wins a boon or a gift and brings it back to save the world. And it's all very, we see it in all the Hollywood movies. So many commercial novels have this idea. It's very much about the individual, and the old stories, whether they include women or actually the individuals, knights, for example, that we tend to think of as heroes, our oldest stories really aren't like that. Joseph Campbell interpreted them so that they were. But when you look back with understanding at the context of the original mythology, they weren't. They were very much more about community rather than the individual. So, in the classic fairy tale, the heroine might be lost into the dark woods because the heroine always has to go into the dark woods or its equivalent. And it's a kind of community of like animal helpers or an old woman or a bird or a talking horse or whatever it might be that helps her. It's the mice that help her spin the straw into gold. She doesn't do any of this alone. And so looking at the stories that I had read as a child growing up in this part of the world, it just didn't fit this whole hero's journey. So that was really what I was trying to do, was just to draw attention to the fact that other values are at play here in these old stories.
I love this idea of the post-heroic journey to really bring in the masculine too.
Yeah, and I think, men have been just as poorly served by the hero's journey in lots of ways as women have, because it's led them to adopt values that have not been good either for them as individuals or the human community or the wider planetary community. So I think there's a lot of turning around now by men, certainly of my acquaintance, who are also looking for alternatives to that. And again, we keep stressing, you do find them in the old stories. You just have to look at them with a slightly different, less heroic eye.
So going back to the feminine and going back to this idea of the women in stories and your quest to find them in the land, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the wilds of Scotland, really, when you kind of were up there in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. I mean, that feels like such an amazing moment in the journey.
Yeah, that was a real initiation. And I had spent 7 years in the northwest of Scotland, close to a wee village called Ullapool on a croft. So, that was kind of wild enough all the way up there. But then I met my husband and second husband now and married him. And we had a bit of a joint midlife crisis. We kind of realized the damage that was being done to the world. We didn't know what to do about it. So, we did the classic thing that everybody does. We ran away. We ran away as far as we could from what we thought of as civilization and ended up on the farthest reaches of, the farthest islands to the west of Europe. And, we could see St Kilda from our kitchen window. It was very remote. And because there was nobody there really to talk to, because it was so remote, and the people that were there didn't really have very much in common with, I kind of made a friend of the land, because it literally was all there was. I had to talk to somebody or something. And so I would do my early morning dawn walks with the dogs, long walks along the headland, along the seaside. And I would just talk to the odd rock that, maybe looked like a human or like some mythical being. I would talk to a seal because I was aware of all of the stories of the shape-shifting selkies. And in a sense, it became real. And I do believe very strongly, as I wrote a little bit more about in The Enchanted Life, rather than If Women Rose Rooted, that if you address other beings in this land, whether they be trees or birds or animals or stones or whatever, as if they were animate, as our ancestors believed, as if they did have soul just like we do, then things start to happen so that you feel as if you are deeply in relationship. So yes, it was very wild. It was very extreme. A lot of good things happened there. A lot of bad things happened there. And it remains, the great love of my life in terms of place, but it wasn't a place where I always say that not all loves last forever. And that's just as true, I think, with places as with humans. Not all great loves are good for you in the long term, So I learned the most profound lesson. I have a great, great love for that place, but it was a little bit too bleak to stay. I would have become a lot bleaker myself, I think, if I had stayed there.
Do you think one of the great lessons was this standing into the storm, facing into the storm? You said you used to stand on a headland or I had this image of you, and it was so strong, the winds, these gusts, this kind of would come and actually would hold you in its grip. This idea of facing, into our darkness.
I'm not sure I saw it that way at the time. I think it's about facing the extremity in yourself. Maybe that's a kind of darkness. Facing the extremity in yourself kind of reflected back at you in both the land and the weather, and having nowhere to hide, just living with the storm pretty much solidly for 4 years, and what that teaches you about endurance. But there is more to life than endurance. And, it was a land that had been largely abandoned by the people that had inhabited it. They'd gone off the island for work, or they'd gone to the town on the island for work, and it felt lonely. It felt as if the land was lonely. There's a strange phrase that they have in Lewis when they used to go to the moorlands in summer with the animals to stay there during the summer for the summer grazing. They used to say that when they went back home, they would be leaving the moor in loneliness, kind of roughly translated. And that's what it felt, that the land was in loneliness. And I was the first person, it felt like, to really kind of immerse myself in it for a very, very long time. And I felt, it may sound crazy to some people, but I felt as if the land was responding, and it had some things to offer and some lessons to teach. And they were hard lessons, but they were the lessons I needed to learn at the time.
When we think about the land speaking back to us, and we start this relationship with the land, and each land mass or place that we go to has a different vibration. Each tree, each forest glade, each river holds its own specific energy. And you kind of arrived and entered into some sort of very ancient and old relationship.
Well, I mentioned, I think in If Women Are As Rooted, I think it's in that book, that I had a dream at one point where I had discovered a very dramatic rocky place that was very hidden. I don't know anybody else who ever found it, but I was haunting that coastline all the time. It was down from the main plateau of the land and kind of hidden among some cliffs, and just remarkable rock carvings in a cliff face, and like a rock carpet sloping down to the sea. And I had a dream the night that I found it, that all of the rocks, the cliff faces and the rock carpet were animals made of stone, and that they were asleep. And I was kind of wandering, along, and I looked up at the cliff face, and there was kind of a wolf with holes for eyes where the sun shone through, and there was a kind of eagle with wings outstretched. And I got to a point where I was going to have to step on the stone body of a sleeping whale in order to go any further. And I heard this voice in my dream say, "Sure you want to do that? Sure you want to step on that sleeping whale and wake it up?" And of course you do in the dream and in life. And I did feel as if I'd woken it up, and as if, that sense of kind of slight foreboding. It wasn't exactly danger, and it certainly wasn't dark or negative, but just that sense that this is serious. If you wake those animals up, there are going to be consequences, and it's not always going to be comfortable. That kind of came true. So I really did feel that, yes, there were energies embedded in the land, in the landscape, as well as in the kind of weatherscape and the whole feel of the place that had certain things to offer.
So when we go back into this idea of the wasteland, and you mentioned in the book that you'd been there for 3 decades.
Yeah, just a little while.
Yeah, just a little while. And the return through the stories, and reclaiming of the stories, the return to the stories. Why the stories, Sharon?
I think because that's where I'd always taken refuge, and that's what I felt I had always learnt from. I was a voracious reader of novels all my life. And in spite of the fact that I studied psychology, I do still maintain that I probably learnt more about human nature and the state of the world, for better or worse, around us through novels than anything else. So that was always going to be my refuge. And I think, part of the problem that I faced by the time I made a final break from corporate life, I would have been 40 or so, I didn't know what to be instead. So I knew that this wasn't it, but I didn't know what it was instead. Now, in the years, the 2 decades since, I've become a great believer in the transformative power of the imagination, that all of my work is about helping people to reimagine their way of being in the world. And that's what I needed to do. So for me, I was always going to start with stories. What ways were there to be in the world if it wasn't this? And it all happened through accident, or not accident, synchronicity. I would use Jung's term for that. Just at the moment where I was ready to make a kind of a break, and had kind of told myself in my head that I had to do something, this wasn't working. A whole bunch of books arrived at my door, kind of catalogues of this and that arrived at my door kind of unexpectedly. I found the right books at the right time. And some of the books that I found were about the stories of female divinity, I suppose, in various traditions around the world, which led me to look more deeply at my own stories from Britain and from Ireland, where my ancestry is, which I had always been presented with those stories as, just kind of fairy tales for kids, just literally entertainment for kids. And I hadn't seen them as a cosmology in the way that Greek mythology is presented as a cosmology. And so it was a real revelation to me to go back to those stories through this circuitous route that I had followed and think, oh my goodness, that women once upon a time in my place were different, were magical, shape-shifted into birds and seals, and were the voices of the land. It's always very difficult to say, okay, how do you get from that to where I am now? And I don't really know, other than by various leaps of the imagination, which began with those stories, if that makes sense.
Well, there's something about the unknown, this moment of trust or just stepping into this unknown.
Yeah, I do believe that if you're going to make significant, really significant changes to your life, as I was, throwing all security out of the window, and security was very important to me, having had a very insecure childhood, then you need to get to a stage where you really feel that if you don't make that change, you'll die. And I did that several times in my life. I did that at the point where I decided to learn to fly, because if I didn't look death in the face, I wasn't going to know how to live. And it was very shortly after that I made my big changes. And I would say it perhaps to a lesser degree, it's happened a year ago when, I had the lymphoma diagnosis, and that shook loose a lot of patterns that I really needed to break once and for all. So you have to just be at a stage in your life, I think, where you know that this is not life, and you have no choice, in a sense, but to kind of, stand up against the storm and hope that it'll hold you up and you're not going to fall flat on your face.
Yeah, and each time it's an initiation, isn't it, into a deeper relationship with self.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one constant in my life, I would say, whether it was as a reader when I was younger, or as a writer, or as a psychologist, or whatever, has been a profound belief in the power of transformation. I think that's what we're here for. So I don't believe in staying still. I mean, I don't mean that, you change things for the sheer hell of it, but I mean that we are supposed to change and grow. And if we're not, then something is stuck in us. And unfortunately, for better or worse, it's often the really difficult times that create the biggest transformation. So there comes a point in your life, and I think I had faced it at that time when I was 40, where I kind of trusted in that. And I trust in it very deeply today. I know if something breaks, that it needed to break. And that something very beautiful will come out of it.
So that rootedness that's grown in you, the fruits of that, there's a sort of a knowing, isn't there, that takes you to a place of surrender, really.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say by any stretch of the imagination that I've always made wise decisions, but curiously, they've turned into the right decisions, because I've learned something very dramatic and quite radical, usually, from the decisions I've made, to go somewhere different, for example. I'm a person that needs very badly to be rooted wherever I am. So I do call myself a serial rooter, but I'm also a person that believes very much in place as the greatest teacher. So I guess what I do now is, if I feel a real pull to a place, I don't just think, okay, I'm moving. I do sit with it for a while, but if the pull stays, then I trust that there's something for me there. And that's what led us back to the UK 2 years ago, on the first day of the first lockdown. That was great timing.
To Wales. Was that to Wales?
To Wales, yeah. I was never going to come back to the UK. Never, ever, ever. I was staying in Ireland forever, until it just nagged and nagged and nagged and nagged. And I realised that's where my work was now.
And in Celtic mythology, it's about this idea of the cauldron, isn't it?
Well, the cauldron in Celtic mythology means all kinds of different things, but mostly so you get cauldrons of plenty that feed everybody. You get cauldrons of inspiration, like the one into which Taliesin, before he was Taliesin, dipped his thumb and sucked up the 3 drops of inspiration, and then became the greatest bard ever known. But what is common about the cauldron stories, and I would say the common motif that underlies all of them, is that the cauldron kind of embodies the wisdom of the other world. And, the other world in the Celtic tradition is not some transcendental out there place or up there place. It is absolutely and completely entangled with this world and enmeshed with it. So you can't have one without the other. The health of the physical world comes, in a sense, from the nourishment of the other world. It's kind of the soul of this world. It's a little bit like the ancient Greek concept of the anima mundi, the soul of the world. It kind of animates this world. It gives it life, it gives it force, it gives it nourishment. And the cauldron always represents that, the life-giving force of the other world.
When you stepped back into the discovering of the stories and the return, this kind of return to self and return to the arms of nature and all of the mythologies, all of the stories, you mentioned that you could feel things opening.
I think that the other world kind of makes itself known to you in whatever ways you can tolerate. I have friends who claim that they can hear the voices of trees. That's lovely. That's not me. That's not how it would happen for me. I don't see visions. I wouldn't like that very much either. Synchronicities I can deal with, and they're incontrovertible. When you take a pack of tarot cards and you pick the same card 6 times in a row, you know that is beyond the realms of probability. I am a statistician and a scientist. I know that. So that's how it works for me when just a whole bunch of things happen. It's just like, this is real. So I think you have to interrogate it. You have to know what's of a place, what's coming from a place rather than what you'd like it to be. And so I think that skepticism is a good thing.
If we go back to this just relationship with the sacred, practical ways of being more in relationship with the sacred, there's a chapter about the wells and how water but the wells were sacred spaces that were maintained by women and how we've lost that. What do you feel is the way back to that sacredness, the daily practice of that?
Well, I think it is twofold. I think part of it is to know the stories, to kind of own the stories, to tell the stories again and again and again. Tell the stories to anybody who will listen. Tell the stories to kids, tell them to your mates. Just keeping the stories alive and that image of womanhood, which is very powerful in the Celtic tradition. Women were the moral and spiritual authority of the other world. They were the ones who bore the grail. They were the ones who gave the gift of the life force, if you like, of the other world. And in terms of the lived experience of it, we find in those old stories all kinds of different ways of embodying that sense of connection between women and the land. So we have, for example, the Cailleach, who is the old woman who created and shaped the land in the Gaelic tradition. She was very much a guardian and protector of the land. We have stories, a couple of hidden stories of women kind of weaving the fate in the way that the Greek fates did, or the Scandinavian Norns did. There are a couple of references to that. There are all kinds of different ways of embodying that feminine wisdom. It's not just one. But to me, mostly what it is creating a relationship with the places where our feet are planted now, whether that's forever or for 3 months, by just talking to it apart from anything else. That's how I started. I talked to things. And there's a point where you feel as if they're kind of looking at you as you walk past thinking, that person just talked to me. Okay, then, So if it's a crow, I'll leave her a feather there in her path every day for the next 4 days or something like that. It's just that sense of relationship. Just treat it as if it was you,
Just treating it as if it's you, which it is. We are all connected. And talking about that, what do you feel about this connection for people who come from other countries and they've settled here? Feeling into the land and giving permission to be part of that story, even if your ancestry isn't Celtic.
I think having a long lineage in a place gives you a particular attachment to it and a particular way of seeing it. But the stories are in the land, and the stories of the land and its relationship with people don't stop with any group of people. So anybody who comes here, the land doesn't care. I always say the land doesn't care where you came from. It just cares that you show up. that you're there, that you're present, that you're engaging with it. I find this a lot because I do a lot of work in America, and a lot of my readers are American. And of course, that's the story of America. Everybody is displaced from their ancestry, except for the Native Americans. And it's kind of compounded by the fact that they feel that clearly they are on land that was taken from Native Americans by them and by their ancestors, which doesn't help. And yet, the land there, they are part of that land's story. And they need to talk to the stones and the birds and build their own relationship with them, just as the Native American peoples would have done thousands or hundreds or thousands of years ago. And it's incumbent upon everybody to do that in their own way. I don't think that there is any exclusivity in any of these stories. If you take it right back down to the archetypal energy, it is going to speak to anybody in any language if they go looking for her. So I think it's really, really important that we see that.
So, Sharon, we're coming to the end of our time together, which has just been so wonderful. When you think about these chapters of your life and the initiations that continue, what do you feel like the Grail is holding for you at this time?
Well, that's an easy question, isn't it? Gosh, you'll save the biggest one for last.
Always, Sharon.
I think my gift, I suppose, using what I consider to be my gift, which is about helping people see the world through the lens of what I call the mythic imagination, and which is to see beyond the physical everyday, which is very important. That's not to detract from the physical everyday, but see this kind of overlay, so that when you look at a crow, you see a beautiful big black glossy bird, but you also see trickster or the Morrigan or, whatever crow is that you look at layers at the world, at a rock, at a bird, at a tree. That's always seemed to me to be the heart of my work. And so in that sense, I don't think it's changed very much, but I think it's just the way that I do it has shifted as I've grown older and kind of stand on the threshold of elderhood myself. And it's more about using energy wisely, I would say, is the kind of personal lesson for me that's tied up in doing that work. Because I think if you look at that old concept of calling, which again comes from the ancient Greeks, that everybody comes here to this world in this physical incarnation with a calling, literally a gift to give, something to offer the world. I think those of us who have a kind of passion or a mission, can forget that there are two aspects to that. One is to put your gift out into the world for the sake of the world, but the other one is to grow as a soul, for your own growth. So for me, I think it's very much about reminding myself that I need time to put my own story together, as well as to be passionate about helping people transform their own.
And when I say those words, love, purpose, connection, to you, what does it evoke?
Love, purpose, connection is that sense that we are all here to offer something to the world, something very small or something very big. It doesn't matter. It's not, I don't think it's measured in terms of greatness or media coverage or publicity or whatever. We are all here to offer something to the world, but we begin by loving our journey, no matter how difficult it might be. And that seems to me as a kind of prerequisite for living well and for fulfilling that calling.
So I did ask you to find something to read, and I'm very excited. Sharon, what's it going to be?
I'm going to read a poem that I included in If Women Rose Rooted, which is one that I keep coming back to. I include a lot of lovely poems in If Women Rose Rooted, but this one continues to resonate with me. And I think it is something that will resonate with a lot of women, particularly who are listening, because I think we all feel like this. And there's a lesson in there to find a way of shifting that energy. And it's by Kathleen Jamie, who is a Scottish poet, a very wonderful poet. And it's called The Creel, which is, for those of you who aren't aware, it's the Scottish word for basket. The Creel. The world began with a woman, shawl-happed, stooped under a creel, whose slow step you recognise from troubled dreams. You feel obliged to help her bear her burden from lull or kelp-strewn shore, but she passes by unseeing, furled to her private chore. It's not seabirds or peat she's carrying, not fleece, nor the herring bright, but her fear that if ever she put it down, the world would go out like a light.
Wow, that's absolutely beautiful.
I think so many of us feel that weight of the world, particularly at the moment. We have to keep everything turning over, everything turning over, everything turning over. And to me, it is increasingly a reminder to put that basket down sometimes, nevertheless, and just take joy in what there is.
Sharon, well, thank you so much. I've taken so much joy in our conversation today.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
To find out more about Sharon, she's at Sharon Blackie Mythmakings. You can find me at Estelle.Bingham or EstelleBingham.com. I really hope you find this new series inspirational and healing. Do rate and review this episode if you've enjoyed it. This podcast is produced by Sarah Cudden. And until the next one, wishing you all more love, purpose, and connection.